Welcome to the channel. Today we're sharing an incredible story of human survival. Their ship, crushed by ice, quickly sank. What happened to them next? On the day the first rays of the 1914 summer sun rose over Southampton Harbor, no one knew those rays would be the last warm gleam for 30 brave men stepping aboard the Uranus, a ship destined to make history as the Endurance. No one, not even the great explorer Ernest Shackleton himself, could have imagined their journey would end not with a heroic Antarctic crossing, but with a desperate fight for survival amidst the largest icy graveyard on Earth. These men were so diverse, from different cities, different social strata, with different pasts and different dreams. Yet in a single moment, they all found themselves bound by a common destiny. Shackleton stood on deck, gazing at the distant, gleaming icebergs, and reflected that life seemed to have specifically prepared him for this moment. He was a man who couldn't sit still. He burned with an internal desire to go where no man had trod. His previous Antarctic expeditions had made him a legend, but he himself considered them merely preparation for a grand triumph, the first ever crossing of the entire continent. He embarked on the expedition not for glory, but to prove to himself, the limits of possibility are an illusion. And if faith is strong enough, the icy desert will yield. Only a man with nerves of steel could be entrusted with the Endurance, and that man was Frank Worsley. Short, energetic, with a perpetually playful smile, he possessed an incredible navigator's intuition. He knew how the waves spoke, how the wind moved, how to predict the ocean's mood. "If anyone can guide us through the ice, it's him," Shackleton would say. Nothing can scare him. Worsley, deep down, had long felt that what lay ahead would be the most difficult task of his life. Wild was more than just the second-in-command, he was the heart of the team. His voice was always firm, his gaze confident, and his presence reassuring. People gravitated towards him. In moments of doubt, he became a rock against which fears shattered. He didn't know how to despair. He didn't know how to give up. If someone's spirits faltered, Wild would lift them with a simple, "Hang in there, mate. We've still got a long way to go." Lean, perpetually tired, yet incredibly dedicated. He understood there were no hospitals or pharmacies in Antarctica. Only him, his bag of instruments, and the strength of his hands. McLean knew that if something happened, there would be practically nothing to save them with, but they'd have to make do with whatever they had. Each man went for his dream. For history. For the desire to see the ends of the earth and leave a mark, even an unnoticeable one, but their own. These men believed they were becoming part of a grand mission. They laughed, made plans, imagined their names appearing in newspapers. No one thought of death. No one thought of fear. No one imagined that fate had already prepared a trial for them that would be spoken of 100 years later. The Southern Ocean did not greet them gently. Massive waves surged, as if determined to capsize the Endurance with a single blow. The wind shrieked like a wild beast. The frost gripped the metal, making it groan. But the men laughed and joked, for they were heading towards their dream. However, the further they ventured, the more fiercely the ocean revealed its true nature. The water grew darker. The air grew colder. Icebergs appeared with increasing frequency. They were like white giants, majestic and silent. They didn't move, didn't change course, and the ship had to weave its way among them. Worsley worked almost without rest. He was in the wheelhouse for 15, even 20 hours straight. But his eyes gleamed, he felt the challenge and embraced it. The men caught icy spray on their faces, laughing, shouting to one another. They were alive, full of vigor. They didn't know that soon the ice would cease to be a beautiful backdrop and become their prison. In early 1915, the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea. The wind intensified. The temperature plummeted. The ice began to close in around them. First thin, like brittle sugar, then thicker, denser, more merciless. One morning, the sailors came on deck to find the ship standing motionless. The ice had locked around them like a steel vice. At first, the crew hoped it was temporary. The Uranus was a strong vessel. It would manage. The ice would yield. The current would free them. But the ice didn't give way. It only pressed harder. It groaned, cracked, boomed, as if alive. And the sounds, those sounds. The men winced. It seemed the ship was groaning like a living creature. Shackleton paced the deck, examining the cracks in the ice. Outwardly he was calm, but his heart beat faster. He knew, the ice could hold the ship for months, or it could crush it in a second. Weeks passed. The ship didn't move. There were no radio transmitters. The world had forgotten them. They were drowning in the silence of a white hell. In the fall of 1915, the ice began to shift. Massive floes came alive, as if an entire continent had awakened and decided to crush the small wooden vessel. One night, the first real impact struck. The ice pressed so hard against the hull that the planks bowed inward. The men heard the walls groan, the rivets creak, the hold filling with icy dust. "The ship, it won't hold," whispered one of the sailors. And he was right. On October 27, 1915, the Endurance began to sink. The ice had squeezed it so hard that it literally broke apart. Like a toy. Like a fragile shell. The men stood on the ice, watching their home, their support, their only path to salvation, slip beneath the waves. The ship vanished slowly, sadly, like morning mist. Only sounds remained, the cracking of wood, the sighs of the ice, and the lapping of water. Shackleton stood motionless. His eyes were red. He knew, now they were just men on the ice. Men in a desert with no water, no food, no communication, no hope. But he raised his head and declared, "We will survive. Do you hear me? We will survive at any cost." And the men shouted back, "Yes, sir." They built a camp they called Ocean Camp. They lived in tents. They slept on fur sleeping bags that froze solid. Food dwindled. They hunted seals and penguins. Their hands were constantly bloody, it was the only way to survive. The men grew thin. They fell ill. They lost strength. But humor, that never faded. "We'll still make it home," Wild would say. "And the first thing I'm going to do is eat a hot pie." Everyone laughed. And that laughter saved their lives. Photographer Hurley. He carried his camera with him, risking his life for the shots. He said, "People need to know what we went through." Photography became his mission. He captured everything: cracking ice, the hungry faces of the men, sunsets over the wilderness, the dead ship. He understood, these images would outlive them all. The ice beneath them drifted. They weren't staying put, they were being carried into the unknown. One day, and they'd be 10 kilometers further. Another, and it was 30. They were not masters of their own destiny. They were tiny figures on a giant white slab that the ocean dragged wherever it pleased. Every night, the cracking ice woke them in terror. The ice could split beneath them at any moment, and then they'd plunge into the freezing water. Shackleton walked among the tents, encouraging the men. But he himself barely slept. He listened to the ice, because that sound could kill them all. In the spring of 1916, Shackleton realized, the ice would never release them towards the continent. Their only chance was to reach open water, get into the lifeboats, and try to sail to the nearest island. This decision was insane. Mad. But there was no other way. They set off. With sledges. With boats. With their gear. The days stretched on endlessly. The ice beneath them buckled, broke. Men fell, got up, and kept going. When, at last, the water appeared, real water, the men wept. To sail across the icy ocean in small boats was almost suicide, but they were ready. They got into the boats. The boats bounced on the waves like splinters. The frost bit at their faces, the wind howled. The waves crashed so high it seemed they would overturn the boats at any second. But Shackleton stood in his boat, the James Caird, and shouted. "Hold on. We must survive." They rowed until their hands bled. Until their skin cracked. Until they nearly passed out. Sometimes the boats almost sank. Sometimes they capsized, and the men grabbed each other by the hair, by the sleeves, anything to keep from drowning. But they made it. They reached a small island, covered in ice and lichen. It was Elephant Island. Small, but real. Land. The men collapsed onto the shore. They shouted. They wept. They laughed. They were alive. But this wasn't the end. Elephant Island was uninhabited. No supplies. No shelter. No chance that anyone would ever accidentally pass by. Shackleton made his last, most desperate decision, to take 5 men and sail 1,300 kilometers across one of the world's stormiest oceans in a small boat to South Georgia, where there was a whaling station. "If we don't return," he told the men, "know that we did everything we could." "We'll wait, sir," they replied. And he left. He left, putting Wild in charge. Wild firmly told the men. "The routine's the same. We'll wait every day. Today. Tomorrow. Every damn day. Sir Ernest won't abandon us." And the men believed him. They believed so strongly that they truly waited. The journey to South Georgia became one of humanity's greatest feats. The boat was tossed so violently that sometimes it was lifted vertically onto a wave crest. Water flooded everything. The men worked like madmen. The wind howled. The sea roared. Storms raged. But Shackleton still stood at the bow and shouted. "Hold on, lads. We'll make it." And they did. They reached South Georgia, but on the other, uninhabited side. And that meant trekking through mountains. Across passes no one had ever crossed. For 36 hours non-stop, they walked, fell, got up. Snow stung their eyes. The rocks were invisible. But they kept going. And they made it. When the whalers saw them, filthy, emaciated, half dead, they couldn't believe it. People thought these three had come back from the dead. "I have 22 men on Elephant Island," Shackleton uttered. "We must save them." Months passed. Storms prevented rescue ships from getting through. One attempt, failure. A second, failure. A third, failure. But Shackleton wouldn't give up. He shouted at the captains, "We have to get to my men." And finally, on August 30, 1916, the ship Yelcho, Chile broke through to Elephant Island. On the shore stood Frank Wild. He had waited. He had waited every single day. And when he saw Shackleton, he smiled and said, "I knew it, sir. I told everyone you'd come." And Shackleton whispered, "Are they all alive?" "All of them, sir. Every single one." And the men, emaciated, exhausted, barely alive, laughed and wept. They had survived. Every last one of them. It was a true feat of endurance. A feat accomplished by people who didn't know the meaning of impossible. The story of the Endurance became a legend. Historians, explorers, writers all declared, this is the greatest survival story. And truly, few in the world could have done what these men did. They were all different. But a shared dream united them. And that dream saved them all. The ship, Endurance, was discovered over 100 years later. And it is one of the most astonishing archaeological finds of the 21st century. Where was the Endurance found? Ernest Shackleton's ship was discovered on March 5, 2022, by the Endurance 22 expedition at a depth of approximately 3,008 meters in the Weddell Sea, Antarctica. What condition was it in? Surprisingly, though, the ship was in remarkably good condition. Its wooden hull was almost perfectly preserved, with the name Endurance clearly visible on the stern. The masts, helm, and deck fittings are all intact, and the absence of bacteria in the icy water prevented decay. The ship looks as if it sank yesterday. It has been dubbed the most well-preserved wooden shipwreck in history. Why did it take so long to find it? That's because its approximate coordinates were known, but ice drift and the movement of icebergs altered the seafloor, and the area is considered one of the most inaccessible on the planet. Furthermore, thick ice cover often blocked access to the water, as a depth of over 3 kilometers presents a significant technical challenge. It was only by using modern underwater drones and sonars that the expedition was able to scan a vast area and locate the ship. Can the Endurance be recovered? The answer is no. Under international Antarctic regulations, the Antarctic Treaty, the ship has been designated a historic monument, and it must not be recovered, it must remain undisturbed.